When you walk past an old building, it's easy to just see, well, a static structure, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a bit dusty, maybe impressive, but mostly just old.
Yeah, just kind of there.
But what if I told you that every single stone, every curve, every soaring arch tells a dynamic, living story?
A narrative.
A narrative of human ingenuity, cultural shifts, and innovations that might absolutely surprise you.
Oh.
Today, we have a really unique opportunity to truly deep dive into that rich, layered history.
That's precisely our mission. We're cracking open a truly fascinating source today. A comprehensive historical text from way back in 1896, simply titled European Architecture.
1896, wow.
Yeah, and what's remarkable, even on the very first few pages, is the incredible precision and, well, the passion of its author.
Oh, really? How so?
They're making specific corrections right off the bat, like clarifying the term echinus.
The cushion thing on a Doric column?
Exactly that, yeah, that cushion-like molding under the top. Or precisely defining Grecian Doric. It's clear this isn't just some dry historical account.
That detail about the echinus really sets the tone, doesn't it? You can feel the author's passion. They actually claim the history of architecture is a study of absorbing interest.
Absorbing interest, I like that.
And get this, they even suggest that a few weeks rightly spent with plans and photographs can be worth many seasons of travel.
Huh. Quite a bold claim for back then, eh? No internet, no easy travel.
Definitely. So our mission today is to extract those most important nuggets of knowledge, giving you a shortcut to being truly well-informed about architectural history, complete with surprising facts and the underlying why it matters.
Right. And we're going to set the stage by covering, well, pretty much everything. From the earliest prehistoric building practices all the way to the majestic simplicity of ancient Greece.
Okay.
Then we'll leap through the Roman Empire's groundbreaking innovations, the early Christian and Byzantine eras, the sturdy Romanesque, and that soaring ambition of Gothic.
And finishing with
the transformative Italian Renaissance and its, widespread influence across Europe.
So what does this all mean for you listening? Well, you're going to discover how architects throughout history solved very real problems, how different styles evolved, and how cultures influenced each other, often in completely unexpected ways.
Definitely unexpected. We're talking about everything from buildings constructed without mortar, like some of those ancient Greek marvels.
Incredible.
To those the book actually describes as model making, not architecture.
Ooh, harsh. Okay, get ready to have your perceptions of old buildings totally transformed.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's unpack this journey, starting from the very, very beginning. Long before classical Greece, people were building. The text hints at really ancient structures, like the Treasury of Atreus.
Which they say was undoubtedly a tomb, massive thing, nearly 50 feet across.
Right, and even as early as the Etruscans in Europe, we see the arch being used commonly. Think about the gateways of Perugia and Volterra.
Or even the famous Cloaca Maxima, Rome's ancient sewer system, arches were key there.
What's truly compelling here, I think, is that even in these early stages, really rough construction could exist alongside quite rich added ornament.
Yeah, the text notes fragments of a rich architectural doorway pointing to a developed and decidedly Asiatic style of decoration in those prehistoric tombs.
So it kind of sets a precedent, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Decoration and structure sometimes following different paths, even thousands of years ago.
Exactly. It's not always integrated from the start.
And then we get to the Greeks. Everyone knows Greek temples are beautiful. But what does this text, written over a century ago, reveal about them that genuinely surprised you? What's the hidden kicker here?
Well, the author describes Greek architecture as, quote, most beautiful and worthy to be studied, and notes how it captivated archaeologists. But the kicker, it's the fundamental simplicity.
Simplicity, so.
Many of these magnificent structures, like the best preserved temple in Athens, often called that of Theseus, or probably Ephesus actually, had no arches, no windows, no chimneys.
Really? None of that?
Nope. They were essentially plain post and beam construction. Think of it like a simple table, vertical legs supporting horizontal beams, but just on a monumental scale.
So it's not just the simplicity, but the precision within that simplicity that's maybe the key.
Absolutely. The source reveals that no mortar was used in many of these buildings.
No mortar at all.
Just stones laid one upon another, relying on weight and friction. Sometimes, yeah, they used iron or bronze cramps, probably for earthquakes.
Okay, but how did they achieve such perfect, almost invisible joints without mortar? That sounds incredibly difficult.
This raises a big question about their incredible skill, right? It's thought that the drums of columns were actually revolved against each other.
What, like spun around?
Yeah, spun against each other to grind their surfaces smooth and get those almost invisible joints. That's an astonishing level of foresight and craftsmanship for that era.
Wow.
And for that perfect solidity and repose, some of the columns, especially at the corners, were set slightly slanting inward at the top. Just a couple of inches over, like 31 feet of height. These tiny, invisible refinements were absolutely key to their aesthetic.
It's remarkable how they achieve such optical illusions and structural integrity with, well, what seem like basic tools.
And their architectural conception hardly included ornamental sculpture as an adjunct, especially in the plain Doric style.
Right. Doric is very plain.
But the Ionic style did introduce volutes, those scroll-like ornaments, and some carved ornament.
And Corinthian.
Yeah, the Corinthian order, with its elaborate foliage capitals, was also used, but the text notes it wasn't really fully matured in Greece itself. It only truly flourished later, under the Romans mostly.
Okay, and it's important to note the contrast in how the Greeks used sculpture, isn't it?
Very important. Unlike later periods, Greek figure sculpture largely developed apart from architecture. They seem to hesitate to carve their buildings in the Doric style, which had basically no carved ornament at all.
Even in Ionic, it was limited, you said.
Pretty limited, but there are exceptions, of course, like the Caryatide order on the Erechtheion.
Where the statues are columns.
Exactly, where female figures serve as columns. And the book praises this as architectural sculpture of the most admirable sort. And imagine this, what we now see as stark white marble structures, originally glowing with color.
No way, colored.
Yeah, with 4 or 5 positive hues, apparently made delicate by light and shadow. Totally different picture.
Wow. Okay, so with the Greeks perfecting precision and that kind of aesthetic simplicity, imagine the next monumental leap in architectural ambition. The Romans.
Right. They didn't just pick up the torch, they transformed it into a blazing inferno of structural innovation.
Especially after inheriting the arch and vaulted roof traditions from their Etruscan predecessors, yeah.
Absolutely. And the Pantheon, built around 120-124 AD, is just Exhibit A, described as a cylindrical tower, 143 feet in diameter and 143 feet high.
Still standing today, remarkably.
Standing uninjured in its essential features, as the text puts it, an example of a perfected system of building and ornament.
So how did they achieve such a massive intact structure like that dome?
The profound revelation here is how the Romans approached construction. That Pantheon dome, along with many other massive hemispherical vaults, was built as a uniform, solid mass of masonry.
A solid mass.
Yeah, made up of broken stone and other material held in a massive, strong mortar. The text calls this monolithic. It wasn't arched construction in the traditional sense, even if it developed from it.
So basically like concrete, like modern concrete.
It's essentially like what we now call concrete foundations, yeah, poured in place, just on an unimaginable scale.
Wow.
And unlike the Greeks, the Romans used the barrel vault, that's like a continuous arched tunnel, and the groined vault, where 2 barrel vaults intersect. That created more complex and open spaces, often huge, but they often avoided intersecting vaults of unequal width.
Okay. And while the Greeks used their columns structurally, the Romans often employed them as, quote, mere decorative appliances.
Right. Think of the Theater of Marcellus, built around 30 BC. Its outer wing wall of piers and arches was massive and solid, but the columns and entablatures, the horizontal bits resting on the columns on the exterior, had a complete lack of connection with the construction.
So, just stuck on for looks, what does this decorative application, this make-believe post and lintel architecture, tell us about Roman priorities?
It's a really critical insight into their philosophy, I think. It shows a departure from that Greek ideal where every element had to serve a structural purpose.
Aesthetics mattered more, maybe, or grand scale.
Often, yeah. Aesthetics and grand scale often took precedence, even if it meant elements were purely ornamental. And interestingly, this decorative application reappeared in the 15th century and has been in use in Western Europe ever since, really.
Huh. That's a long legacy.
And if we connect this to the broader picture, the Roman imperial architects were remarkably efficient. The text highlights a peculiarity of the Roman work as its economy and actual cheapness.
Cheapness, really,
Yeah.
for things like the Pantheon.
Compared to its size and mass, yeah. These perfected buildings must have been wonderfully inexpensive, thanks to huge forces of men, abundant materials, and a clear process to finish their structure out of hand and have done with it.
So almost like the ancient Roman equivalent of flat-pack furniture, built quickly, efficiently, and then they were done with it. Except instead of a bookshelf, the Pantheon.
Huh, exactly. A pretty good analogy, actually.
But this Roman efficiency, this ability to build vast structures cheaply, well, couldn't last forever. The very fabric of society was about to unravel.
Yeah, with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, we see a dramatic shift in architectural ambition and capability.
As we transition into the early Christian and Byzantine eras, say from about 350 to 750 AD.
You're right. There was a huge demand for new buildings, especially churches. But in Western Europe, the situation just deteriorated dramatically.
How bad was it?
Building was often done without intelligent skill, with very inadequate means, and without other possible decoration than that furnished by the plunder of earlier structures.
So they were literally reusing bits of old Roman buildings.
Absolutely. Plundering them. It was an era when no consistent style of architecture could truly arise, a stark contrast to the previous Roman mastery.
And what's fascinating here is the stark contrast with the East, right?
Totally. While Western Europe struggled, the eastern provinces, under the undisputed sway of the emperors at Constantinople, could still build. And this is where Byzantine architecture truly flourished.
Hagia Sophia being the prime example, finished in 538 AD.
The great prototype. What made Byzantine vaulting so innovative was their use of vaulting with the greatest freedom and in great variety of form.
More freedom than the Romans.
Definitely. Unlike the Romans, they weren't tied to conventional rules, and their vaulting could express a freedom and variety that was truly innovative, particularly their use of the pendentive.
Ah, the pendentive. That's the sort of curved triangle thing.
Exactly. That lets a circular dome rest neatly on a square base. A brilliant solution. Even if their exteriors in places like Ravenna were often plain brick, the interiors were a revelation of light and space.
So out of the fragmentation of the so-called Dark Ages, a new form of ingenuity emerged in the East. Okay, moving into the Romanesque period, roughly 750 to 1150 AD.
We start to see the reemergence of consistent styles in Western Europe, especially in church building. Charlemagne's chapel at Aix-la-Chapelle, for instance, was very similar to earlier Italian round churches.
And a key development was in vaulting again, wasn't it?
Yes. We see half-barrel vaults used to take up the thrust of nave vaults, sort of anticipating the flying buttress system that would come later.
So they were starting to figure out how to handle those forces pushing outwards.
They were trying. Romanesque builders often used groin vaults, but really struggled with their powerful outward thrust. In churches like S. Ambrogio in Milan, the diagonal arches were often built much higher than the transverse arches, creating a vault that had no true mathematical form above them. It meant the arches below sometimes merely assisted in building the wooden centering.
The temporary wooden framework.
Right, the scaffolding for these cupola-like forms, these sort of small dome-like structures. Imagine trying to build a massive dome but not quite having the geometry down.
So you fudge it a bit with the scaffolding.
Kind of. You end up with something that looks dome-like but relies on a lot of hidden support. That was the ingenuity but also the struggle of the Romanesque.
And the text points out that in places like spires, in Germany, the immense weight of the vaults could cause walls to spread and arches to just come down.
Yeah, so much so that flying buttresses were built later as an afterthought, just to save the church.
An afterthought. Wow. It suggests a constant tension between their structural ambition and the limits of the engineering knowledge at the time.
Exactly. The text notes that Romanesque, despite its developments, was ultimately incapable of a considerable development into a truly great style for the huge scale required for large Christian churches.
Why not?
It was just too massive, too contained. It couldn't allow for the vast, unencumbered interiors that would become necessary later. That path would be forged by Gothic architecture.
Which brings us neatly to Gothic, the soaring ambition of Western Europe, from about 1150 to 1300 AD, originating mostly in France.
Right. And here, the rib vaulting system was key. It provided a skeleton or a cage of strong arches that supported the lighter stone shell above.
Concentrating the forces.
Exactly, exerting powerful pressure at specific points. And this is where the flying buttress truly comes into its own.
Finally. Not an afterthought anymore.
No, it was integral. It effectively transferred the powerful outward thrust of the nave vaults outside the building altogether.
And how did this structural innovation transform the experience of being inside these buildings?
It transformed everything. The fascinating result was this resultant lightness and slenderness of the interior architecture. It allowed for immense windows, stained glass, and a dramatic sense of height, like you see in cathedrals like Soissons.
And it wasn't just aesthetic, right?
No, the Gothic structure also allowed cathedrals to rise dramatically within town walls, visibly asserting the bishop's lordship. And this raises an important question about the role of sculpture, too.
How so? Different from the Greeks.
Very different. Unlike the Greeks, 13th century sculptors were truly architectural sculptors, creating work intended as decoration for specific architectural features, not just standalone pieces placed nearby. It was integrated.
Okay, here's where we see a fascinating divergence, though. While French Gothic was refining this daring structural logic,
England developed its own unique perpendicular style. Features like fan vaulting, where the ribs become almost purely decorative tracery, those open, lacy patterns in windows or on walls.
beautiful, but maybe less structurally pure.
Perhaps. But then there's Italy. The text explicitly states that pointed Gothic, despite being introduced to Italy complete, apparently from Eastern France, was not understood nor adopted as a national style.
Not understood. What does that mean? What does this tell us about Italy's architectural priority?
This isn't just a historical footnote. It reveals a fundamental cultural clash in architectural philosophy, I think. While the French were obsessing over structural logic and engineering daring,
The Italians just weren't interested.
they just weren't interested in that kind of bones-first approach, it seems, perhaps rooted in their classical heritage. The text claims the Italians have never been a building race, in the same vein as the ancient Egyptians, Greeks, or the Gallofranc populations who produced Gothic.
That's a strong statement.
It is. Italian Gothic, as seen in churches like S. Anastasia in Verona, often shows a lack of finish and of organization when compared to northern examples. They prioritized decorative surface beauty and lavish ornament on often structurally simple masses,
Rather than the
rather than the architecture of construction and organization, of reason and logic that characterized French Gothic. So you really have two distinct architectural philosophies existing side by side.
And this divergence becomes even more pronounced as we move into the late Gothic and Renaissance periods, right?
Absolutely. In France, late Gothic or flamboyant pushed tracery and pierced work to incredible extremes, making buildings appear almost like a delicate cage.
Meanwhile, Italy was undergoing its Renaissance.
Marked by a deliberate return to classical Roman forms.
But how accurately did they return to them?
Well, that's the interesting part. If we connect this to the broader picture, the text suggests the Italian Renaissance itself was often uncritical and absolutely devoid of the archaeological sense when reviving classical forms.
Uncritical. How?
They didn't necessarily understand the original structural purpose of, say, a Roman entablature. They often applied it purely decoratively, much like the Romans themselves did sometimes, as seen in the Pantheon, where it adorned a vaulted structure with no purpose but the further decoration.
Huh. And Brunellesco, a key Renaissance architect.
Even he misinterpreted Roman monuments, according to the text. For example, making arches spring directly from columns in a way that was not identified with the true official Roman style.
So the text is essentially saying that for some Renaissance architects, the facade, the appearance, was everything. It was less about integrated structure and more about creating a grand illusion.
Almost like a theatrical set, yeah. This concept of scenic designing versus true architecture is a critical distinction the text makes. It challenges our modern understanding of structural integrity in design.
It's not just a historical observation. It's a philosophical critique embedded right there in the text from 1896.
Exactly. And this return to classicism was immediately successful in Italy, but the text notes that Gothic art continued to flourish in places like France for another century,
Leading to
often resulting in awkward combinations of styles, like a French chateau with basically medieval plans but Italianate decorative details slapped on.
So this really highlights how styles cross borders, were adopted, adapted, and sometimes even misinterpreted.
We see this in the slow adoption of the Renaissance in France and Germany, blending with persistent Gothic forms, or in England's perpendicular style, which developed its own elaborate fan vaulting and decorative ribs.
And this era also saw a huge change in the architect's role itself, didn't it?
A massive change. The substitution of drawings to be closely followed, even in minute details, replaced the traditional, more free-form methods of the master builders who worked more directly on site.
Changed everything. Okay, wow. What an immense sweep of history we've just explored.
It really is vast.
From the practical, unmortared precision of the Greeks. Remember, even revolving column drums to grind surfaces smooth for those almost invisible joints.
Incredible stuff. Right up to the Roman engineers' mastery of monolithic concrete vaults and their ingenious, if purely decorative, application of architectural orders, often for no structural purpose at all, like we saw in the Pantheon.
Yeah. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, think about the stark differences in building during the so-called Dark Ages in Western Europe.
Where skill was described as inferior and materials were often just plundered from older structures, a real low point, structurally speaking.
Contrast that with the remarkable freedom and variety of Byzantine vaulting, like Hagia Sophia, with its innovative use of pendentives.
A completely different trajectory in the East.
Then came the reemergence of consistent styles in the Romanesque period, really grappling with the immense thrust of their vaults.
And then the daring structural logic of French Gothic, leading to revolutionary phenomena like the flying buttress, which allowed for those soaring, light-filled interiors.
But then that fascinating divergence of taste we discussed. How Italy, the birthplace of the Renaissance, was never a building race, in the same way as the ancient Greeks, according to this author.
Yeah, often prioritizing decorative surface beauty over structural innovation, resulting in that lack of finish and of organization in some of their Gothic work, effectively creating two distinct architectural philosophies existing at the same time.
Two different ways of thinking about building. And finally, how these styles cross borders, were adopted, adapted, and sometimes, yes, even misinterpreted.
Like the Renaissance's slow adoption and unique blend with persistent Gothic forms in places like France and Germany.
And the truly unique perpendicular style in England, with its elaborate fan vaulting and decorative ribs. Plus, the era of precise architectural drawings replacing traditional methods, forever changing the architect's role.
Yeah, fundamental shift. So, to leave you with a thought, if, as this 1896 text suggests, the Italian Renaissance itself was often uncritical and absolutely devoid of the archaeological sense when reviving classical forms, what does that imply about the nature of authenticity or maybe purity in architectural styles? Is there such a thing?
That's a good question.
And how might understanding these long historical conversations and sometimes, awkward combinations change the way you appreciate the blend of old and new in the buildings you encounter every day?
Prompting you to see not just structures, perhaps, but stories of ambition, compromise, and ongoing artistic evolution.
Exactly. Something to think about next time you're looking up at an old facade.